Hello and welcome to the Aural Apothecary podcast, authentic chat about medicines, pharmacy and healthcare in the UK.
Pharmacists Jamie, Gimmo and STC take on topical and controversial stories but keep it edgy yet light-hearted.
Pod guests share their career-defining drug, song and book and also share their joyful patient stories.
Welcome to the Aural Apothecary podcast. My name is Jamie Hayes. For this episode, we're joined by Louise Jenkins. Louise is a patient with cystic fibrosis. We will welcome Louise in a moment as she shares a drug for our formulary, her career anthem, and recommends a book for the Aural Apothecary Library. For our micro discussion, we continue our look at an article in the Sunday Times earlier this year. The NHS is flatlining. Here's how to save it right now, by Health Editor Shaun Lintern. But first, let me welcome my two fellow apothecaries. STC is in Bournemouth and Gimmo is in Cardiff. Welcome both.
Evening.
May the force be with you on May the 4th, and also every day. May you rise like a skywalker with a new hope, and let no empire stand in your way. On May the 5th, don't be Darth or a Sith. For every dark side, see a ray of light. Happy Star Wars Day to every human, alien, Wookiee, droid, and Ewok. May every rebel have a great Jedi Knight.
Couldn't stop him, sorry, listener.
I'm lost for words and very moved, Steve.
Well, I know it'll be after Star Wars Day when it goes out, but it is Star Wars Day today, so I couldn't help myself.
My immediate reaction was going to do a Wookiee impression, but I'm not going to embarrass myself.
I should just say that is taken from @AlOnTheBoard, who's on Twitter, but he is a writer and he writes these, I can't remember which tube station it is in London, but he writes these on the tube station. Every day he writes something funny and creative, and this is today's, so that's where it came from. It's not mine.
Well done. Very good.
Gimmo, what have you been up to?
Busy week of work. I came across something last week. I was chatting to one of the pharmacists in work. Have you heard of a druggle?
Indeed.
Yeah, it passed me by a bit, and so it's...
They've been around for a while, actually. I saw the little sort of social media
What is it?
hiatus, but they've been around for a few years.
Yeah, well... The reason I was interested, I've been looking at safety huddles and how, as an organisation, we can perhaps use these a bit better, a bit more consistently, how we can support the teams across the organisation to use them. And then I found out some of the pharmacy teams, and this was Rebecca Owen, who's, I think, a neonatal pharmacist, and I think there's a few people across South Wales doing it. And yeah, so a druggle is a safety huddle, but obviously specifically focused on medicines. And so they'll pick up on a couple of the incidents that have happened that week. They'll have a medicine safety topic, and they'll just discuss it in a 5-minute huddle. I think it's once a week they do it. But also one of the things they do, they issue a certificate to the prescriber of the month. So they nominate one of the, I'm assuming, doctors, but it might not be, and issue a certificate of prescriber month, and then say, you know, what was it they did well? So it's a bit of positive affirmation as well. So I just thought it was useful. I mean, interesting, and something I'm going to look to share across CTM.
So I'm aware of them from an intensivist friend of ours who works in St George's in London.
Yeah.
And she's mentioned to me how useful she finds them for many years. So they've been doing them for a little while down there. And so, yeah, she really values them. So I've got something for us. Look, see if you recognise this. Mark Talbot, alumni, Professor Mark Talbot, just published a paper with his colleagues in the Postgraduate Medical Journal on speaking up at conference Q&A sessions.
Ooh.
So they've Mark and his colleagues describe their work as a useful guide for conference chairs and attendees to spot behaviour that may be or may become disruptive and aggravating to others. And they suggest that there are 10 in all that make up their SURPASS assessment scale. Let's see if you recognise any of these. You can play along at home too. Number 1, delegate will ask a long-winded question and insert numerous facts and figures about their own experience/work that then drifts further and further away from the initial topic under discussion. Recognise that, anybody?
Yep.
Number 2, question. What question? Delegate pretends to ask a question of the speaker or panel, but then proceeds to launch into a long monologue about their own work, essentially presenting a mini abstract of their own. Sometimes can start with, it's mainly a comment, but, and can end with, I don't really have a question, to be honest, just thought I would share that.
Yeah.
And so they identify a few. Look, timing of the question. After the chairperson had announced there's only time for one further short question, please, before lunch, a delegate launches into multiple long questions. And then things I've been guilty of, I think, cornering the speaker after they finished.
That's you.
Hogging the speaker after they finished in a
to get them to come on the podcast.
Yeah, it doesn't work. In a post Q&A time, was occasionally seen as problematic. And then this one really does annoy me. Microphones. Delegates who choose to station themselves in mid-aisle areas so that it's difficult to get the roving mics to them, and who then decline to use a microphone, meaning they're not heard by anyone.
Recognise a lot of those.
Did you spot us in there, Jamie?
There's a few, I think. There's a few. But interestingly, I had a bit of a dialogue with Mark over it, and he said he's had a very interesting mailbag as a result of publishing the article. Not all positive.
So just remember, if you're new to the podcast, in the first series, Professor Mark Talbot was an excellent episode about palliative care. So I suggest you look that one up. I think it was episode 1.5 or 1.6?
1.6, I'm going to go with.
1.6. So, and it links quite nicely to, we all listen to The Rest is Politics. Did you see that they had just passed 50 million downloads this week for their podcast? We're a little way behind that.
Stretch goals.
Yes. But they were talking today about oracy. Did you hear that? And I think that's what you're aiming for there, James. The ability to express oneself fluently and grammatically in speech. And they were talking about the need to teach oracy as well as numeracy and reading and writing in schools.
Very good. Okay, should we move on? Our great pleasure to welcome Louise Jenkins to the Aural Apothecary. Louise is 25 years old and has cystic fibrosis. She was diagnosed with CF at 8 months old. Growing up on the Isles of Scilly meant having to fly to Cornwall every few months with one or both of her parents for checkups. Hospital stays in Cornwall were often for 2 weeks at a time every few months. From the age of 8, Louise was in hospital for 2 weeks every 3 months consistently, with the nurses and doctors and physios becoming like a family to Louise. When she was 20, she had a pneumonia resulting in a 3-week hospital stay for the first time in years. A double lung transplant came on the table for discussion. Louise highlights that the physical side of her CF is one thing, but points out that she's also suffered with depression for years. She has an incredible team at University Hospital Llandoch in South Wales, and with the help of some miracle drugs and her team, family and friends, she's healthier than she has ever been and so much happier in herself. She now runs her own nail business and loves what she does. Hi Louise, welcome to the Aural Apothecary podcast.
Hi, thank you for having me.
So Louise, if we bumped into you in a pub, a bar or a coffee house, what would we learn about you, about what's going on with you?
Oh gosh, so much. I don't know where to start. CF's part of my life, but it's also my whole life. It's hard not to let it take over, but it's one of those things you just get used to, I guess. It's all I've ever known.
So how do you explain it to others when you have to let people know that you're a person with cystic fibrosis?
I usually start with it's not contagious, because that's one thing that people always think, because it's something to do with my lungs. So when I cough a lot, people think I'm going to spread it and whatever. So I start with that. I explain usually that it's to do with my lungs, but it's to do with all my other organs as well. It's just, it affects my lungs more. So I do spend a lot of time coughing. I take a lot of medicines every day. I do lots of physio for my chest. It doesn't affect, it doesn't ruin my life or anything. It's always been there, but it takes up a lot of my life. And people have described, and I agree, it's like a second job. So imagine you're having 2 full-time jobs and one you can never leave. It doesn't go away on my birthday or Christmas or on holidays. I have to take it all with me. So it's a lot of work, but I think if you've got a good team and a good support system, you can cope with it.
One of the things that one of our previous guests, Graham Prestwich, I think it was, one of the terms he used was, he said that having chronic disease, you almost need a project manager. And so he describes the patient as the project manager, and I think that's what you're describing there. That's another great analogy, one for you, Steve, there, isn't it? That, being ill is like having a second job. You've got a whole set of tasks that take up a huge amount of time.
The other thing that resonates with what you said is when we spoke to Deborah, she's had 2 kidney and 2 pancreas transplants. And when we asked her later on about her drug choice, she came up with Deb on fire, because she said, like you, I think what you're saying is that she's never known anything. She's been unwell most of her adult life, and therefore she'd like to just, perhaps not quite the same for you, but she said she'd quite like to wake up every day and be able to do, exactly what she wanted without any restriction. Do you recognise that?
Yeah, definitely. There are days where I want to just wake up and just do none of it and just live as a normal person would. But if I do that, I become ill afterwards because I need to take all those meds because they help keep me healthy and happy. So it's an annoying balance.
So there's no break.
Never a break. I think that's the difficulty with when people who don't have long-term illnesses and things like that don't understand or can't relate, because I never ever get a break. You know, sometimes you can be like, oh, I'm on a diet or whatever. You have cheat days,
Cheat
but
day, yeah.
I don't have that. So it's hard work, but
Because I
it's
can
one of those
remember
things.
Jamie Brewster, who was one of the cancer sort of patients we talked to. He talked about literally needing to take a run up to take his drugs, and it was a tough period for him. But it did end for him, didn't it?
He's completing his 200th park run this Saturday.
There we go.
That's amazing.
Louise, I used to work in Manchester in a hospital, and it was one of the adult cystic fibrosis centres. So I was quite used to interacting with patients with cystic fibrosis. And certainly before electronic prescribing, you would know if the patient was on Pierce ward, because that was the name of the cystic fibrosis ward. Hello to anybody listening who might be there. Jan Redfern was the cystic fibrosis pharmacist for many years and was much loved there until she retired. But in the old days, you could tell by the number of prescriptions. I don't know if you've ever seen one of those fold-out prescriptions. If it was 3 prescriptions deep, it was definitely from Pierce ward. You didn't need to ask.
Yeah, that sounds about right. When I go to my clinic appointments and things, they still have all the paper folders. And if you've only ever been to the hospital once or twice, it's about 3 pieces of paper. I've got about 7 of these folders, and they are massive. Like, they're just never. I don't know how they find anything in those.
Yeah. Well, that's a bit of a moot point. You must, I'm sure, interact a lot with other people who've got cystic fibrosis. And do you find that there are varying degrees, though, of how people deal with it? In other words, whether they are perhaps as adherent with medicines as you are, or perhaps you've had times in your life where you haven't been adherent. Because I know from my experiences when I've come across such patients that there are those, and I totally, I can only empathize with their situation, but I could understand why you just sort of give up for a bit and go, I'm not taking these anymore. And then, as you say, you do get into trouble. So I'm sure you have lots of conversations with people about that.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, that, because I do know people with cystic fibrosis, but the really interesting thing about people with CF is that we're not allowed anywhere near each other. So cystic fibrosis has a massive risk of cross-infection. So I'm not allowed near anyone else with CF in case I make them ill or they make me ill, which is a very bizarre conversation to have with someone who doesn't understand that. For example, so I did do a year. When I went to uni, there was another girl in the same like halls as me in the same course and everything who also had CF, and we were put in contact via the university with like phone numbers, so we never actually met up or anything. But we would text each other when we got to lecture halls and tell each other which side we were sitting on, so that we wouldn't sit the same side. And I'd have to explain to people I just met who have now become friends for years, and say, I'm really sorry, I can't sit next to her. Can we go and sit over here? It's a really bizarre conversation to have because people are like, why? What's wrong with sitting next to each other? But unfortunately, it's just a big risk that most people don't want to take. So it's a crazy crazy thing to think about, because most people obviously have the support groups if they become ill, like obviously the big like Macmillan support groups for cancer and things like that. Having said that, I do have friends with cystic fibrosis. I met quite a lot of people through Instagram during COVID, which was really nice. We created a big WhatsApp group, which was really nice. People all over the world with CF, so we sort of chat through there. I knew a few girls growing up as well with CF, and I'm still really close with one of them. And we do meet up, but we check with each other if we're okay with seeing each other, and if one of us has got a cold or something, we won't go anywhere near each other. But it's everyone, yeah, it's a crazy thing to think about when you don't experience it daily.
So love interest is going to be a problem there, isn't it?
Yeah. I don't know if you've ever heard of the film called, I think it's called 5 Feet Apart. Came out a few years ago, and it's I think it was described as similar to The Fault in Our Stars, which is obviously about two cancer patients who fall in love. But 5 Feet Apart is based on two cystic fibrosis patients who fall in love. I personally haven't watched the film because I just think it might be more sad than I intend to put myself through, because obviously I experienced it. But I know that the film was produced and had help from a girl with CF who has now sadly passed away. But she was an American. She helped give them advice on what would be realistic in the film. So I know there's mostly people don't get together if you have CF, because it's not a great idea, but it can happen, I guess. So luckily for me, I have a boyfriend, so I'm okay on that one.
I was just going to explain for the listener that, just to clarify, what this is about is that what patients with cystic fibrosis don't want to get is they don't want to get colonized with particular organisms, which then make it incredibly tricky. And there are some well-known organisms that once you've got them, if you've got cystic fibrosis, it's not possible to actually eradicate them. They just have to be treated quite frequently when they get an exacerbation. And so I'm sure it does sound very bizarre to the listener what Louise just said, but it is the truth, and they're trying to avoid, as she said, but it's particularly around organisms that cause these respiratory infections that can cause, at worst, fatality, but they can cause colonization, which is then very, very hard and changes the course of that person's cystic fibrosis. I don't think I'm underestimating that, am I, Louise?
No, thank you for explaining the proper science behind it. I don't have all that information.
That's fine.
That's his job, Louise. He's the only clinician on the
resident
call.
clinician. So Louise, you mentioned like having a second job, and that's the relationship between you and cystic fibrosis. What we're perhaps interested a bit more in detail is your relationship with your medicines. Describe that for me, growing up as well, you know, going through that sort of those school years, teenage years, and then transitioning into adult services, I suppose.
Yeah, I've had a roller coaster of a ride with my medicines. So when I'm a kid, my parents looked after me a lot, and they made sure I took all the medicines I needed, and the school was all aware of everything that I needed to do. And sometimes I would have to leave lessons and go and do some physio or go and take some medications, but the school were all really good. Teenage years were hard because every teenager wants to be a normal kid. They want to just grow up and have crushes on people and like have a really easy life, and having the extra added of I need to be sensible because I need to have all my medications and things like that. I used to go into hospital for like 2 weeks at a time, as you said at the beginning. And during my teenage years, my mum and I learnt how to administer the intravenous antibiotics ourselves. So I would go home and I would do them at home for 2 weeks. But it would mean that during the middle of school, I would have to leave the lesson for a bit and go and have them attached by me or my mum, and then go back to the lesson with what looks like a little baby's milk bottle. And I'd walk around with that. And I've always been quite open about my CF. So everyone in my class knew what I had and knew what I was doing. So I didn't feel uncomfortable in that sense, but equally, I just wanted to not have it and just to get rid of it. And I think when I got to my late teens, and especially when I came to university for like the year and a half I was there, I did okay with taking my meds, but the adherence comes and goes, because if you're hungover, there's no way you want to get out of bed and do some physio and all of that stuff. So, and as also mentioned, you said like about I've had depression and anxiety for several years, and when you spiral, as I have, it kind of takes one after the other. So if your mental health declines, my physical health declines, and vice versa. So I've had times where I just don't take anything for days or weeks because it's just too much for me to handle. I usually end up back in hospital for a couple of weeks, and they help me, and the nurses are encouraging me and helping me take my meds regularly. And once you start sort of climbing back up, it's not so bad. But there are definitely there's been a lot of work going into my life, and it's not always been easy. But when you're in a good place, you kind of look back and you think, oh, it wasn't too bad. But when you're going through it, it's quite hard at the time.
bringing us up to date now, what does your medicine burden look like?
I was thinking about this earlier, actually. I think I must take about 30 tablets a day minimum. So it's a lot of tablets. I take some nebulizers and some inhalers, things to keep my chest going and like keep it all awake and active as opposed to being a couch potato. Mainly the meds aren't too bad. You can kind of chuck them all in and take a big gulp of water and you can go. But sometimes it still feels like an effort. It still feels like a slog to get them all done. Yeah, there's been some incredible medicines that I've had, and the doctors are always checking with me to make sure I'm taking them and to see if we can get rid of any to help me out and have more of a normal life. But I'm always going to need them regardless. So
Yeah, and final one from me before I let somebody else in, sorry. You obviously looked after, you mentioned the team that supports you in, that's the All Wales Cystic Fibrosis Centre in Cardiff. How does the rest of the healthcare system deal with you, and when you bump into contact with that? I'm sort of community pharmacists, general practitioners.
I don't have a lot to do with my GPs because I obviously have my big team at the hospital. So if I ever need anything or I have appointments, I have regular 2 monthly appointments anyway. So if anything needs to be done, they usually just fax a copy to the GPs and they can see that. So I don't have a lot of interaction with my GPs. The pharmacy I go to, I have a lot of interaction with because I collect medicines regularly, and the pharmacists at mine are amazing. It's taken, I mean, I've been there for a few years now, but it takes some time to get used to someone with CF because we do take so many medicines, and I don't always take things monthly. So some things are every other month I take, and some things are special request items. So you have to make sure you order them in enough time so that they can come in. But the pharmacists are really good there. I've never had any issues with them. They always try and get them in. Sometimes I'm really late on ordering, and they go, "We'll do it as fast as we can for you." So if there's a new person in, it's a bit difficult if I move pharmacy because there is just so many things that I take that it can take a while for them to get used to it. But I've been there for so many years now that it's fine. They know that I call up, I'm like, "It's Louise." They're like, "Yep, we know who you are. We'll get that in."
I can remember when I was working in community pharmacy, we had a patient who had cystic fibrosis, and they always used to bring their prescription in at 5:45. We only had 10 minutes to go, so we had a really good relationship with them. But you think, oh my God, I'm never going to get this filled by 6:00. It'll take about half an hour. But yeah, no, I mean, there are certain patients when you're community pharmacist that you do actually develop a very good relationship with, either the parents or the patient, depending on the condition. But it's that cystic fibrosis is one of them. I think every community pharmacist probably knows quite well and has a very positive relationship, hopefully, with their patients who have cystic fibrosis.
I can't fault pharmacists, honestly. You guys have a lot of work to do, and I have full respect for anyone who has that much going on in their lives. I've walked in before, and there have been people screaming and shouting, and I just think it's not gonna make it any better. Just be nice to them and ask what you need, and then leave it at that.
And sometimes, I hesitate to say this, but sometimes those people that are shouting up and down the most are perhaps only shouting and getting in a stress about something for a corn on their foot, whereas you're actually dealing with a life-threatening long-term condition. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I think when they see me walking out there with my 2 full bags of medicines, they feel a bit bad because I'm there just walking out with all of these meds, and they're there for one prescription. It's quite a difference.
Yeah. I mean, I think, again, for the listener, we should remind people that, back in the 1950s, people didn't really live beyond the age of about 5 or 6 with cystic fibrosis. And now with the changes in treatments, and we were talking before about the risk of really nasty chest infections, that all changed a lot in the 60s and 70s because they had more powerful antibiotics. But now the average age is that people will live, I think the average age is like 44 or something like that. And obviously people live longer than that. Higher than that? Is it higher than 44?
Oh. I was being just happy. That was just me dancing.
Yeah. So, and all of that really is, it is due to better care, but a lot of that is about the medicines.
Yeah, when I was born, so I'm not 97. I was born in, and I think one of the not very good GPs at the time told my mum that some people live to the age of 10, which is not what you want to hear to your newborn child. So I think
Wow.
the fact that in the past 25 years that has changed from about 10 to mid 40s is absolutely incredible. And obviously, I mean, for me, even better. Keep it going. Get as high as you want. I'm here for ages.
Yeah, sure. Absolutely.
I mean, you sent through, didn't you, Jamie, one of the information leaflets that was associated with some of the newer drugs, and I just found it fascinating because it talks about things that you wouldn't consider with other drugs. So it talks about things like, well, you know, and stop me if these aren't topics that they're good, but things like survivor's guilt, how to deal with this by taking some of these drugs that are wonder drugs, the sudden sort of, I don't know, reduction in symptoms and how that can affect you psychologically, because you're not suddenly, going back to the point Steve made about Deborah, suddenly you are feeling normal. So I just think it's remarkable is the wrong word, but it's such a, as a condition, it's almost unique, isn't it, I think?
Yeah, I would definitely say it's unique, and I would call the drugs remarkable because I've been on one of these drugs for a few years now, and it has changed my life. I don't think I have survivor's guilt as such, but getting used to being really ill and then changing quite dramatically to being really quite normal was a big step for me, and I didn't know what to do with myself. I had all this time where I didn't need to be doing lots of meds and things like that, and this is how I've been able to open my own business and things, because I've been taking these drugs for a few years and I'm feeling just so much better. So I would say it's remarkable, but obviously I am biased.
So your business, Louise, give it a shout out.
Yeah, go for it.
Nails by Lou. It's based at Belle Toujours on Cathedral Road in Cardiff. Come by and see me.
Very good.
And as we established before the podcast, I'm going to get it in print. My daughter's getting a discount when she comes in.
Of course, absolutely.
So, Louise, you said that, you didn't currently suffer with survivor's guilt, but again, I know that when I left Manchester, these very new drugs, because remember, again, for the listener, we're talking about, if you like, some of the really early stuff around genes and understanding these gene variants. And there is this thing, isn't there, where you can have this spectrum of people with cystic fibrosis, but if you haven't got the particular gene variant that these new drugs actually can help with, then, and I remember this because they were just coming out and we were involved in the trials there. I wasn't particularly heavily involved in them, but I sat on the Drugs and Therapeutics Committee, so we had to consider these things. And of course, at the time they weren't fully licensed, and everybody who was on the register, if you like, in the unit was desperate to have it. Of course they were, because they wanted it to change their life. But if you don't have the particular gene pattern or the gene mutation, then there wouldn't necessarily be as effective. And I say I'm not an expert on this by any stretch of the imagination, but I'm sure you are aware and know people who don't have the right gene issue to be able to actually get the benefit from these wonder drugs.
Yeah, so when these drugs became available in the UK, sort of widespread, a few years ago, it was actually 2020, so during that lovely year of COVID we had, I was in contact with a lot of people on Instagram who have CF, and there are over, I think, 2,000 different mutations of CF, the genes. I am lucky enough that both the genes I have are the same, and they are the most common ones. So I was able to get this drug, but there are lots and lots of people that unfortunately this drug just won't work for. And for them, I will continue to advocate for CF and the CF Trust and the foundation and all of that, and just say we still need to be pouring money into this, because like I want everyone to feel as good as I do with these new drugs. And I saw recently that the drugs have been approved for children between the ages of like 2 and 5 in America, for certain gene types again. But I'm just hoping that it comes to the UK quickly and just all across the world, because it is just something that needs to be done. And you've made such a massive leap forward with this big drug, and it needs to be just spread out across the whole CF community now.
I'm guessing we're going to talk about the drug a little bit later, perhaps. So I've got a book in front of me. It's called Breath from Salt. And have you heard of it? Have you read it?
I've not read it. I have heard of it.
Okay. And so it's about the journey of developing these new agents. And chapter 49, the title of chapter 49 is What Mutation Are You? And then it goes on to say, this is what personalised medicine is really going to look like. It will be 10 genes causing a disease rather than one, but this is the model. This is the model of how it's going to play out. And that's by the chief exec of Vertex.
Yes, Vertex, the lovely company.
Indeed. So I'm sure we'll come on to more about the medicines in a moment. Just quickly before we move on, you mentioned the team around you, and I suppose it'll come up perhaps. The clinical psychologists are a big part of that team within cystic fibrosis care as well. Can you tell us more about working with them?
Yeah, absolutely. I see my psychologist regularly, and she's definitely helped me massively, especially, obviously, like I said, I have depression and anxiety and been on tablets, but the tablets are only one half of it. Talking therapy is incredible, and I think everyone really should have access to free therapy, but it's in a dream world, I guess. But I think there's just so many parts to the cystic fibrosis life, and like even so obviously the age of 44 is incredible that it's like the average lifespan now, but that's still at least half the age of regular people. So that is one of the big things I've dealt with over my life, is dealing with the fact that potentially my lifespan won't be as long as everyone else's, and all the aspects that come with it, and the fact that I have so much to deal with every day, but I want to be normal, and all those things that come together, and having someone there who you can just talk to and who can help you through it is just so helpful. And I can't praise the psychologists enough, because they're always there when you need them. If you you book appointments, but if you need to see them sooner, they'll get you in, they'll be there for you. And the team I have the team I have is incredible in Wales, and they all work really well together. And yeah, it's obviously really personal, like depending on the psychologist you speak to, not everyone gets on with everyone, but the lady I speak to is amazing, and she's helped me over the past few years with even sort of a side note of, I never used to be able to swallow tablets. I always had to have liquid or chewable tablets, which probably sounds hilarious to people, but
Not at all.
No, not hilarious, just how difficult it must have been, because I know how many medicines you'd have been taking.
Yeah, so she helped me using Tic Tacs and things learn how to swallow tablets. Completely random, but useful in all senses. So
the Aural Apothecary is sponsored by Jamie Hayes Executive Coaching and OneLessPill.com.
Okay, thank you, Louise. I'm sure we're going to come back to something to do with cystic fibrosis drugs maybe shortly, but fascinating as ever. And yes, I'm sure that the listener really can't get their head around it, because if you've never worked with and you don't know anybody who's got cystic fibrosis, you will struggle to understand just how complicated and how much is involved. And it's, you're a testament to the people who've got cystic fibrosis. Your enthusiasm is really coming through. And so we really appreciate you making the effort to come on the podcast. So one of the benefits of coming on the podcast is also you get to give 3 things. And I'm sure you know, because you've been told about the plan. So the first one is a medicine, which is something that evokes a very powerful memory for you. So what would you like to offer for the Aural Apothecary formulary?
My medicine is Kaftrio, or I think it's called Trikafta in the States. It came out a few years ago now. I got it on compassionate use because I was very poorly at the time. And it's changed my life massively. Few little drugs, you don't know how life-changing it's been for me. So that would be my drug of choice there. I used to wake up coughing all the time. I could never sleep. I spent, as stated, I spent 2 weeks every 3 months in hospital. And within a week of taking these drugs, I wasn't coughing anymore, basically. I haven't been in hospital in over a year now, and I'm just so much healthier and just feel so much better in myself because of them. They've changed everything. So internally grateful.
And just for the listener, this is one of these gene variants that you've got, and this drug is specific for, if you've got that particular gene variant, it will help. And as you said, revolutionized care and your life.
Yeah, for me, it is a miracle drug, and I could never oversell it. It is the best thing that's ever happened to me drug wise. My family, my friends, everyone was just so grateful that I had the opportunity to take this, and the fact that it's worked. So I tried a couple of other gene therapy drugs beforehand, and neither of them really worked for me. And so the fact that Kaftrio has, it absolutely made my life just a million times better. It makes me feel like I have a future now, and I'm living to live a good life rather than living just to be alive, if that makes sense.
Beautiful.
So that sounds great, Louise. When did you go on it for compassionate use? When was that? Because they came into
February 2020.
Okay, because they came into Wales and England and Wales in summer of 2020, didn't they? Sort of late summer, they became available. Yeah. And you started on it in
the February 2020.
Okay. So and you noticed a difference within a week?
Within a week. Within a month, I'd hit a lung function that I never ever thought I'd hit in my life. So I cried because I was so happy. I could breathe easily, and it was just absolutely incredible. As stated at the beginning, there was a talk of double lung transplant literally about 2 months before I got this drug. Luckily, touch wood for me, I never had to have the double lung transplant because I started on this drug, and it helped me. So yeah, it will forever be my favorite drug I've ever had in my life.
Well, I mean, it mentions that in the leaflet that I've got here, because it says I won't read it word for word, but it's along the lines of some people emotionally, that the improvement is, it sounds weird to say it, but the improvement is so great that emotionally it's very difficult to handle. And listening to you, I could understand why.
Yeah, I think it was. I spent most of COVID alone because I lived on my own, and my family were all like key workers and things. So I was isolated, but it kind of worked well for me because I could really focus on like taking this drug and making it better. And when I called my family and when I saw them for the first time after about 6 months, and I said, like, this drug's changed my life. Look how good I am. Look how much better I feel. Like, I'm going to be around for a lot longer now. We were all just very, very emotional because you just don't grow up thinking you will have that sort of life when you grow up with CF, sadly. So the fact that I can is incredible.
So that's part of that emotional and behavioural journey, isn't it? Of potentially thinking you don't have this future to plan for on all very practical fronts, financial planning, educational planning. There's a huge amount, isn't there, around this treatment and the impact that this group of modulators aren't they, that are having on CF.
Yeah, it's crazy. I've never really been worried financially and things like that, and that is because I'm quite a realistic person, and I try not to be pessimistic, but I am realistic, and there was never need for me to worry about buying a house and things like that because I was never going to be around for it. But now I am, so probably shouldn't have spent all that money on alcohol in uni.
Nah, I disagree.
And so you're describing some therapeutic breakthrough, Louise, and the impact it's had. Yet, even in this space, there'll be some of your fellow CF patients that don't quite get on with it or aren't happy to take it. Can you explain a bit about what you understand of that?
Yeah. Unfortunately, for those who obviously can't take it, it's really sad, and there needs to be drugs available, but they are working towards those. For anyone who can take it and who doesn't, there's so many different things and reasons behind it. It's probably majority of mental health reasons, just things that they don't feel like they need it, or they don't feel like they want the help, or it just feels like it's a handout rather than helping. And it's really sad to think about because this drug obviously for me has done so much, but then equally some people take it and it doesn't do anything, and it feels very deflating. When I first took it, and this might sound a bit pessimistic, but when I first took it, I didn't put my hopes up. My hopes were just like, it might do something, it might not. You never know, because the previous 2 drugs I tried didn't do anything. But when it did, it was really great. But I think people don't want to get their hopes up because you've got this idea of what CF is like, and if you put your hopes up too high and it doesn't reach them, it is really hard to deal with. and it just sets you back, I think. So it's a difficult one because, and that this is why the psychologists are so important, and having a good team around you and your family and friends and all that to support you and help make these decisions for you is just really important.
This is also where you realise the real benefit of the NHS. So I don't know if you talk to anybody in America or across the world, but I'm sure that you will have come across people who can't afford it, because there is, in this country, of course, it's free, but it's £8,500 a month. But I'm sure you know that you've spoken to people, I'm sure, across the world who would love to do it and might even have the right gene profile, but they can't afford it.
Yeah, the NHS is incredible, and I will advocate that until the day I die, because what they do is absolutely incredible work. The fact that I have all my medicines for free, and Wales in particular don't even pay for prescriptions, which is amazing. So, but yeah, it's really sad that across the world that there are people who need these medications and who could have amazing lives with them and just can't afford them. America especially is obviously just so expensive to have medical insurance and to buy your medicines. And I've actually spoken to someone who is from Lebanon, who has CF, and sadly they can't get half the medications that we can here, and it's hard to speak about, and you want to do everything you can to help, but there's only so much we can do from a different country.
Absolutely. But it's, when we're all floundering around in the NHS Armageddon, as Gimmo likes to call it, we need to remember the good stuff. And I think we should leave it there, because this is the good stuff.
Yeah.
Agreed.
One final bit on it, Louise. Look, it has to be taken with... How do you take your calf trio?
He's testing you now.
You have to take it with fat-containing substances, I think is the way to say it. So I take...
It's a dream.
I know.
It's a dream. That does not exist for any other medication I can think of.
So just explain that for the listener then. So this needs to be taken with fat-containing foods.
With a Mars bar.
Yeah.
McDonald's.
I tend to take it with breakfast in the morning or something like that, and in the evening it's biscuits or hot chocolate or something that has a lot of fat in, because it helps. I don't know the science behind it, but it obviously is more effective when you take it that way.
Yes, to do with the absorption. But yeah, it is very unusual to have to take a medicine with a fat meal.
Yeah, it's strange that, because people with CF, and me especially, you don't put weight on as easily. So I spent a lot of my childhood being sort of fed 100 meals a day, trying to get my weight up and keep it up and all of those things. In Calf Trio, I haven't needed to take any extra protein or fat containing drinks or anything like that since I took it started taking it 3 years ago, which is amazing, because otherwise you're constantly trying to eat, and it does get too much. So eating as much as you want sounds incredible, but when you have cystic fibrosis, it sounds awful, because you've got to do it consistently. I think there was something you had to take sort of double the amount of calories you were meant to every single day just to maintain weight.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think it's about 5,000 calories or something like that. So yeah, that would make sense.
That's one of the behavioural things that is happening now as well, I think, Louise, isn't it? That with people being on therapy, that is changing their CF journey and course. If you continue putting that many calories into your body, it can have an impact.
Yeah, it's been difficult weight-wise for a lot of people, I think, because there is that thing that we've always been told to eat as much as you can and drink as much like milk and things as you can, because it's good to put weight on. And then as soon as you start taking this tablet, you're putting loads of weight on, and you're like, oh, I need to cut back now. And it's finding that balance then.
Can't resist, Louise. Look, if you were in England, then you'd be paying for your prescriptions for all those items.
Yeah, I have borderline diabetes as well, so I wouldn't. But
most cystic fibrosis, unfortunately, do have diabetes. So yeah, they generally, even in England, don't pay for their prescriptions.
Thankfully.
Cystic fibrosis, it's like someone, if you're playing a computer game and the task was to invent the most bizarre and awkward condition that exists, you'd come up with cystic fibrosis. Every time, even when you get a drug, there's still something a little bit quirky about it, isn't there?
Honestly, it's hilarious to describe it, because I don't tell people everything. Usually people don't want to hear it all, but there's so many things I take, and people go, "What do you take this for?" And I'm like, "Oh, well, that does this, but it has an added side effect of this," and it's combining them all together is.
It's the Republic of Cystic Fibrosis. That's what it's known as. Anyway, moving on. Excellent. Lovely to hear. Okay, Louise, the other thing you get to give us is a anthem or a health journey track for the Aural Apothecary Spotify playlist. What would you like to offer us?
Yes. So mine is. It does have a backstory to it.
Good.
But mine is "Scouting for Girls." She's so
Uh-huh.
lovely.
Love
So
it.
a very classic song. Everyone good feel good tune. The sort of thing behind it, my mum used to play it a lot as a kid, so when I was ill, I would always be listening to it and things like that. But the main sort of story for me was when I was, I think, 20 and I had pneumonia. I went to the hospital for my clinic appointment and they were like, yes, you have pneumonia. You need to come in for a few weeks of antibiotics and to get better. And the very next day, I had a ticket to go see Scouting for Girls in Cardiff. And I said, I'm not coming in yet because I want to go and see Scouting for Girls. And they were like, but you're really ill. And I was like, yeah, but one more day won't make any difference. So I went to the concert with my friends and bless them, they were so worried about me. They were like, are you sure you want to go? Like, do you need to be in hospital? I was like, one day I'll be fine. My best friend called me like, I knew you wouldn't go in, you're such a terrible patient. And I was like, I'm gonna go in tomorrow, I want to watch the concert. And it was one of the best concerts ever. They are amazing performers. I know all the words to all the songs, and I think personally for my mental health it helped me get through the following 3 weeks in hospital and then the following sort of 6 months dealing with the after effects of pneumonia. And it was a really good boost for me because I could listen to the music and I can remember being in the concert and being with my friends. And I think even though probably shouldn't have delayed it by a day, I just thought you still need to live your life, and that's what I wanted to do. So that's my song choice.
The healing power of music.
Exactly.
And a classic example of, well, I don't know if it's quite shared decision making, but it's about listening to the patient, isn't it? Aren't they playing in Cardiff again soon, Louise?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Are you
I
going
don't.
or?
I don't think my doctor was very pleased that I made that decision, but no, I'm not seeing him in Cardiff, sadly. But
They played in Bournemouth this week because my wife and my daughter went. They were the support act to Ollie Murs.
yes, they were here. I think last week my friend went to see them, but
There you
I
go.
sadly didn't.
It'll sound great on the Spotify Aural Apothecary playlist that really is on Spotify. Right, and the third thing, looking forward to this, and this is a book that has influenced your life or your health journey or thinking for the Aural Apothecary Library.
So this one actually has nothing to do with my health at all. I used to read a lot as a kid, and I haven't read anything in years because I just feel like when you become an adult and you drink loads of alcohol and you're off partying, and then you're like, oh, I can't really be bothered to sit and read a book. So, but one of the books I have read in the past few years is called "Women Don't Owe You Pretty" by Florence Given. I'm a strong feminist. Like, I believe in equality for everyone and all of that. And it's a book basically talking about how you need to sort of accept that you have privileges, whether it be like your race or your gender, or whether you're able-bodied or disabled and things like that, and sort of accepting everyone as they are, but also just like the way women have to deal with all of these things. So obviously, like, it's kind of difficult to explain, but it was a really empowering book to read as a woman. Especially, I was a single woman at the time, and I live on my own, and I run my own business, and it was just very empowering to read that there are other women out there doing these things, and that even though you are a woman, and sometimes that is not as easy to get places in life, you can still do all of these things, and it's just very, very empowering to read.
Well, you're certainly not alone in the female guests who've picked similar books. Go on, Paul, you were probably going to say.
I was just going to say there's a whole subcategory of similar books, Louise. So have a look because we got quite a few books along that theme, and we've all read some of them as well. They've been great. So what was it called again?
It's called "Women Don't Owe You Pretty" by Florence Given.
Because I always end up buying the choices like that for my mum, so I'll be getting that one for my mum.
I recommend.
She's our number one listener, Gimmo's mum.
And so, Louise, one of the questions we asked our previous guest in the episode just before this was, what was it like being a female surgeon, training in the world of surgery and medicine? And again, it was quite a telling response.
Yeah, I can imagine it's not easy. So fair play to them for being them.
Very good.
Good choices.
Our micro discussion next, looking at the recent article in the Sunday Times, the NHS is flatlining, here's how to save it right now. So, Louise, two things really. Did you have a chance to have a look at the article? And because of all your experience of healthcare, we'd love to hear from you on how what would you like to contribute to our discussion?
Yeah, I did get a chance to read it. I agreed with the majority of it. Some of it seems sort of amazing, but a little bit unrealistic. But most of it seems like such a good idea. And I just think the NHS is such a brilliant organisation and it needs to be saved. And the more we can do to help, the better. I did listen to some of the previous episodes, and I remember someone saying about project manager to let the patient look after themselves a bit more and that sort of thing. And it kind of resonated with me. But what I would add is that as a child growing up with an illness, I would often not be talked to. They would talk to my parents, which understandable, especially when you're a baby and you're a toddler and the younger ages, the kid just wants to run around and have fun, and you need to talk to the parents about what they need to do. But as you get older, I think the biggest realization for me that I didn't know anything about myself was when I moved up to Cardiff and I went to my first appointment at the Adult Wales Cystic Fibrosis Centre, and the doctor said, "So what do you take these medicines for?" And I said, "I don't know. I don't know what any of them do." And it's because even up until that point, I was about 19, but my mum had still been driving me to my appointments, so she'd been coming with me, and she always sort of looked after me in that sense. So I didn't really have any idea what most of them did. And I knew when to take them and how to take them, but there was never really that input of sort of, I'm trying to think of the right words, a discussion so I could help decide which I wanted to take and why and when. And I think if maybe there's a bit more input in making children aware, helping them not decide everything, but decide bits and pieces, like when they need to take this or how they need to do this or which medicine's better for them. And so they're aware of what they're doing. It might help them do more and be more aware of why they're doing this. Kids still want to be kids, and it's hard to find that balance. But from my personal opinion, I just had no idea what I was doing, and it felt very overwhelming when I had to look after myself. So yeah, that would be my sort of input.
I think that's just a classic adulting as you went off to university, wasn't it? I mean, Jamie couldn't peel an orange when he went to university.
That's funny.
So, very little exposure to oranges, Louise, other than cut up into chunks at half-time at a rugby match.
So, but what you said there, Louise, as I've been listening to you throughout this sort of conversation, I can't help put myself in the position of your parents. You're only 10 years older than my daughter and closer to Steve's and Jamie's kids, I think. But I can sort of understand where your mum has come from in terms of probably taking over and feeling responsible and wanting to manage everything. But I guess what you're saying, and there's lots of young people and children with chronic conditions, is perhaps we could get better at involving them in decisions about their own care and how they manage it. And that applies to lots of aspects of how we raise children these days compared to how we may have raised them 20, 30 years ago. Maybe medicine hasn't caught up with the rest of society on that front.
Yeah, I will never fault my mum. My mum did an incredible job raising me and my sister and helping me look after all my medications and sorting them all out for me. And it's just the best mum I could ever ask for. But
make sure she listens to this and hears that.
Yeah. I think there's just that. I think when the doctors are always talking to your parents, because that's how it's been done, it's hard to then involve the patient a bit more. And I think that's the balance you need to find, is that I probably didn't want to have an involvement when I was a kid, but as I became a teenager, there probably should have been more Louise, what do you think? What should we be doing rather than just telling me? Because I think there was a stage where I just lied to my doctors all the time, saying that I was doing everything. And when I sort of got to Cardiff and I realised that I was ill, but they weren't helping because I was telling them I was doing everything, I thought, right, I need to just be honest, and then they can tell me what is realistic to do if I'm
There
not
you
able
go.
to do it.
The truth is outed.
I've always lied to my doctors.
I did.
You know, the thing is though, Louise, and it's such, as Gimo said, it's such a lovely, it's so nice to hear your story, you know, and with such good, you know, good situation that you're in currently now, and how incredibly hard it must have been for your parents. But I know health professionals do try really hard to speak to the adolescent or the child. And sometimes, and I don't have a huge amount of experience with pediatrics, but sometimes it's impenetrable. You can't get past the parents. Do you know what I mean? So it's a bit of an unfair one. I think we take your point, and that from the ingredients point of view, it's like try where possible to involve children and adolescents directly more in their own care, because essentially what you've just said there is it's a bit like when you pass your test, you know, when you learn to drive, you only really learn to drive a car when you pass your test, don't you? That's why I wasn't joking when I said you've just got adulting when you left your house and went to university, because you had to do all of those things, didn't you? Whether it was do your own washing or whatever. It was a bit extreme, obviously, with the medicines, but there was a similarity. And so some parents, like Jamie's, peeled his oranges for him. Other people taught their children to peel an orange from an early age because there was no risk involved in peeling an orange.
Yeah, I think it would just be nice if I was slightly less overwhelmed, because I think it really it was hard to live alone and like to look after all of this, and it would have been nice if the doctors had been like, when you live alone, like because they knew I was going to uni, so it would have been nice if there was sort of maybe an in between section when they went, you need to like know all of this. Whereas it kind of went from, we'll talk to your mum to okay, you need to deal with everything. And there was that gap that really, it was hard for me. But I do understand what you mean. It is just part of growing up. But it would have been nicer, I think, from my opinion, if there was something that closed the gap a little.
Louise, is there any mentorship that goes on? So are you a buddy for anybody that is going through those sort of teenage years now that's transitioning into adult services at all? Does that happen?
No, not really. I think the CF is quite a closed off community because we aren't allowed anywhere near each other. So I think, and obviously with confidentiality and things like that, I imagine it's sort of an issue. I think they are trying to put like things like that in place. I was part of a VR experience once, and there was another person with CF on it. It was a very strange experience using a VR headset, but I think they are trying, but it's obviously slow progress with things like that.
Okay. Thanks, Louise. A big thank you for joining us on the Aural Apothecary, for sharing your stories, her desert island drug, her career anthem, and her book for our Aural Apothecary library. Coming up next time, we'll be joined by Paul Woodgate. Paul is a patient with Parkinson's disease and type 2 diabetes. We look forward to welcoming Paul to the Aural Apothecary. You can contact us via Twitter at Aural Apothecary. We're on LinkedIn. Visit the website, theauralapothecary.com. You can email us at auralapothecarypod@gmail.com. Gimo now with a final ingredient.
Okay, so thank you, Louise. Steve doesn't allow us to use the word amazing, but I'm going to use it. You got an amazing story, and I really enjoyed listening to it. And I'll say it because I'm a parent. You're a credit to your mum who brought you up. It was fantastic. Okay, so final ingredient. I want to talk about empathy, actually, which is, it does tie in with the theme of this episode. Do you remember way back in episode 1 when we talked about compassionate healthcare? And we had a bit of a back and forth, and I was a little bit skeptical, not about the idea of compassion, but about the way the concept was used, and thought that the real issue was empathy. Well, it turns out a lack of empathy can be disastrous. The reports into numerous scandals, such as the avoidable deaths at mid-staffs and the maternal scandal at Shrewsbury and Telford, concluded that a lack of empathy exacerbated the problems. So why is this a problem amongst healthcare professionals? Well, a recent article in The Conversation suggested that it might be due to how medical students are trained. And do you remember this was a theme we touched on last episode in the conversation with Liz O'Riordan? Training that focuses on a biochemical model of diseases, dealing with stressful workloads and promoting the influence of role models leaves little room for students to think about what it is actually like to be a patient. This approach can lead to cynicism and becoming emotionally distant and desensitized, and this then lowers the empathy of those trainees. So the report makes a number of suggestions, and again, we touched on this last week. Firstly, have students walk a mile in patients' shoes. For example, get them to spend a night in ER or experience what it is like to see another clinician. And secondly, think about the biosocial model of disease as well as the biomedical, because patients are much more complex than they're often taught about. And thirdly, get real patients into the classroom. Something, in terms of our series this year, we are way ahead of the game on the Aural Apothecary. So you might be worried that this will be difficult to implement. Well, I do know how you feel, but it's something we've got to do.
This was a 3 Apothecaries production. Sound engineer Jimbo Slough. Original music Jamie Brewster. Artwork by David Baker.
Thanks for listening to the Aural Apothecary podcast. Warning, always enjoy with an alcoholic drink, especially if operating machinery.
This episode of the Aural Apothecary is sponsored by onelesspill.com, a medicines optimization consultancy.